For this week's history resource, I'd like you to turn your attention to the National Park Service site of Hallowell Furnace. This is the preserved site of an iron furnace in the Pennsylvania hills that produced both household and farm iron objects for the surrounding countryside, as well as naval cannon for both the British and later American ships. This was an especially exciting site to visit because it has heirloom animals, mainly cattle and sheep right now, representing breeds that would have been on the land to feed and clothe the workers. Though realistically, much of the cattle that provided the beef for the iron workers was raised on surrounding farms, or at least their fodder was. Some of the original buildings are still present. The old spring house is still there and bears a mystery metal box of unknown purpose. Other buildings have been refurbished or entirely rebuilt. You'll probably be unsurprised to learn that the shed around the blacksmith's forge burned down more than once. But old stove plates, the imperfect, unsaleable ones of course, from the 19th century are there to be seen, along with both replicas and actual relics of stoves and cannon that were made there. The ranger staff is knowledgeable, and they are doing all sorts of updates and refurbishments, some to recover from COVID closures and some that were already in the works. Besides that, it's an absolutely gorgeous setting, trees, flowers, and it's a birder's paradise. Giving the opposite side of the city is scary and very bad for you, the country is clean, healthy, and healing. And if you're really curious, there's a whole book written about the place in the 1960s, Hopewell Village by Joseph E. Walker. Some of the scholarship is outdated, but much of the primary information is still fascinating. So if you're in the Philadelphia area and looking for a good picnic trip, I can't recommend Hopewell Furnace highly enough. So go ahead, send in questions. The end of the season show is just 2 or 3 weeks away, depending on how deep into outdoor work I go. And let me know if you have a history resource you'd like me to share. Episode 89, 18th Century Housekeeping, Inside Edition. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at what the labor situation looked like in the 18th century British colonies. Over the entire century, things changed a lot and not at all, depending on where you were living, how much money you had, where you were born, and the color of your skin. To take a peek at some of the founding indoor labor patterns of America before it was America, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that families rarely looked like the adults only living with their children style of families that seem to be the only way to go now. If anything, that was the rarest sort of arrangement of all. How people organized themselves into living groups was influenced by biblical guidance, habit, what sort of labor was available, and legally enforced codes. There were a variety of arrangements. Probably the most comfortable and common arrangement was the multi-generational household with grandparents, adult children, and then their children, and maybe another generation after that. If the family had been in place for more than 3 generations, then there were often close-by cabins or attached structures, housing cousins, second cousins, poor cousins, accepted bastards, and their families, and maybe a few awkward relatives that no one could exactly explain. It was also common for people to live in mostly single-sex groups of unmarried people. In the colonies, this was almost always groups of men. For at this time, and then over and over in areas that recruited men as labor, there would regularly be very skewed ratios of men to women. Also over and over, this ended up as a bad idea and resulted in death, disease, massive food poisoning, and starvation. But having men who can't or won't cook or do sanitary work, soap making, laundry, dishwashing, and healthcare, mixed with the belief that women serve no role but distraction, stays on as a destructive but prevailing organizing principle. Occasionally, women banded together as living units, and this was usually as religious orders, but they had to be careful of displaying excessive success or prosperity. They would usually end up being accused of prostitution or being invaded by men who were quick to point out that their general lack of legal standing under the law prevented such arrangements anyway. And then there's just simply the human fact that large groups of women are unlikely to want to do entirely without the company of men, in just the same way large groups of men are unwilling to do entirely without women. Along with extended families and single-sex groups, there were often communal-type living arrangements. Military situations and work sites often had these. Smaller family units might have rooms, or if they were high enough status, huts or houses around a common cooking area, smokehouses, food storage, etc. Military barracks knew better than to do without the sanitary services and repair work of women. And sometimes women would even accompany soldiers on campaign. Notably, George Washington was very impatient with women who worked as support camp followers, as they were generally known, and I'll get more detailed about that next season. The larger farms and plantations that were developing in the colonies would often have a large house that held the multi-generational extended family of the owners. Then there would be other buildings that held the extended families of the people who held high-status jobs for the operation. Overseers, housekeepers, brewers, and such. Then there would typically be an assortment of bunkhouses or sturdy lean-tos or tents for hired single people holding lower status and temporary employment positions to occupy for their few free hours when they were resting or sleeping. If it was a plantation with a medium to large population of enslaved people, there would also be a set of buildings that were used to house them. As the cities and ports grew, a new and yet very old situation would emerge. Groups of unclearly connected people. For the growing urban poor and the landless and captive populations of the New World, illiteracy was common. Possessing written records of lawfully recorded family connections was uncommon. Oral traditions of family records were usual, but were often disregarded by people in power. So it could be unclear just how groups of people were related or connected when looking at them in written records. In fact, this need to have proof of legal connection in a chaotic society of no fixed traditions helped the wedding traditions of young America to become more elaborate and fantastical. Okay, so all sorts of ways to live. And to live in these groups, there were lots of jobs from daily to quarterly to seasonally that needed to be done. In fact, there were so many that to be even moderately comfortable by 18th century standards, not to mention 21st century standards, we really are pretty pampered. There was a huge list of tasks that had to be done regularly and with human sweat. There were so many indoor or household tasks that needed to be done that one usually needed something of an inside workforce to make sure that all the jobs got done. There were seasonal jobs of harvesting and processing and storing food. There were periodic jobs like making soap, weaving cloth, making medicines, perfumes, scented waters, liquors, and cleaning potions for both the skin and for different items around the house. There were repairs of clothing and household objects, planting household plants, foraging for herbs and other plant foods, large-scale cleaning, and delousing. Then there were the weekly jobs like laundry, baking, and brewing, not to mention the daily jobs of cooking, washing, and fire management. No one or even two people could manage such a load, or at least not well, alone. And of course, the fancier and more socially prominent a home was, the more jobs there were. Rug cleaning, silver polishing, candle trimming, dressmaking, and fitting and putting on. The clothes of the 18th century were not really made for getting into alone, especially not for women. In fact, you could partly tell the class of people, especially women, by how much of their clothing needed other people to put it on and take it off. There could also be the need for hairdressing, bedmaking, and childcare. So where did this workforce come from? Remember back in episode 41 when I spoke of orphans as a common supply of imported indentured labor? Yeah, well, by the 18th century, the colonies had their share of domestically grown orphans. Oh, yuck! That sounds absolutely awful. And, well, being an orphan in the 18th century colonies was generally a pretty bad draw, all things considered. Being a bastard, that is, born outside the bonds of legal marriage, being a girl, or being considered of the black race, even a little bit, made it worse, of course. See above for biblical guidance and legal codes. Now, it was not quite as dire as being an orphan in 19th century London along the lines of the little match girl, but it was not much better either. All in all, if you were going to end up an orphan, the smaller the community that you ended up an orphan in, the better. If you were in a small, extended family on the edges of European settled land and ended up as an orphan, okay, that would likely mean curtains if you were entirely on your own. There was always a small chance that you might be swept up by a local tribe. Now, this was not common, but did happen enough to be noticed and written about. On more than one occasion, colonial children who had been orphaned by a variety of circumstances had been taken in by local tribes. The cases were notable because when they were found or quote-unquote rescued, as often as not, these people chose to stay with their tribal family, which is a whole other set of stories I'm not going to veer into because it's long and it's deep and it's complex. Anyway, if you didn't die out there alone, this was not a bad way to end up orphaned. It was a rare enough circumstance, though, that all sorts of fantastical adventure stories and romance novels will result from the imagined results of this situation. The second circumstance was being orphaned in a village made up of just a few large extended families and probably a single small church. This was typically not so bad either. One was usually simply absorbed into one gaggle of cousins or another. Again, a very typical situation and realistically not that indistinguishable from being fostered out or being sent out to apprentice in a workshop. The next circumstance, the medium-sized village of many families, a bustling economic presence, and more than one religious center. You could still end up doing okay if you were clever and a go-getter and were old enough to have some skills or smarts. You might get scooped up as free labor and come out okay in the end. Or if you weren't the sort of kiddo who was wanted, you might end up essentially as a slave. And not one particularly valued since you couldn't be real property. Having dark enough skin to be counted as property, should someone be of such a mind to make you property and thus make you more valuable, that wasn't really any better. And by now, versions of the 17th century slave codes had spread to all 13 North American colonies, so it made designating people as property based on skin color, regardless of their actual status, possible, and not just orphans. Now, definitely the worst way to be an orphan was to be one in one of the big cities of the age. There you were already a city kid, so you likely had no chance to gather the agricultural knowledge that would be valuable to the currently agrarian society. Cities were also the one place where there wasn't a chronic labor shortage. While smaller population centers might want to nurture an orphan to take on needed labor and maybe pass on a skilled trade, in large cities, where there was more competition for resources, charity was less certain. And it was in cities that orphans were most likely to happen. Disease through sewage and concentrations of waste, in general, were much more common. As in London before it, sewers, trash management, and water systems had not been considered in the cities of the New World either. The idea of the city as a dirty, smelly, dangerous place again was starting to gain currency as true, much the way London and other large English cities had done as they had sprawled about and covered over and surrounded their river ports. As a result, all sorts of disease and infection, usually compounding injuries which were all too common in the unevenly mechanical world of the 18th century, could carry off adults and leave their dependent children as orphans. So there were 3 distinct ways to end up being considered an orphan at this point in colonial history, and a 4th depressing fact. The first way to become an orphan was to have both parents killed. That's the simplest way and the most common in the stories. The second way was to have your mother die, usually while pregnant or giving birth to a younger sibling. Because European men were more or less helpless when it came to childcare and food preparation, if they didn't live in an extended family environment, it was common to consider young children orphaned if their mother died. The children might be absorbed into other families, but they also might be simply left behind. Frustratingly, some Americans seem to have forgotten this part of our past, and they want to pick up this historical trend of allowing women to die of maternal risks science and medicine have worked for hundreds of years to end. The third way to become orphans was to have a father die. If the mother didn't live in an extended family situation, she would be entirely without monetary support to house or provide food for her children. In this age, there were few occupations a woman could do for pay, and there was no way for a single person to take on all the tasks required to feed and clothe a family and earn enough money to provide all the materials that could be turned into food and clothing. The single person in an apartment thing we have going now was literally an impossibility in the chop wood, haul water economy that the colonies existed in. A woman might leave her children with other people, usually family members, to go earn a living, or again, she might just abandon them. So in these two situations, even though only one parent died, children could still be considered orphans and treated as such. I don't have statistics on how often this happened, but they were possible fates. Now, the fourth depressing fact is that some children were considered to simply be parentless by the fact of the circumstances of their birth. Children born to either one or two enslaved parents were usually considered to not have any parents. Enslaved people under most slave codes did not legally have families. Along with these children not being allowed to have parents, it also robbed them of most of their childhood. They were expected to become skillful and sturdy and valuable as soon as possible. Being childish, playful, innocent, or silly was never to be their lot. Wow, that is a lot of depressing stuff about orphans. Anyway, it comes back around to the fact that people didn't always live in ways we think of as typical, that is, in nuclear families, couples, small groups, or as individuals. Realistically, you lived as part of a larger group, family or otherwise, and it was not great to be an orphan or other sort of parentless child, because such children were a meaningful part of the indoor workforce. For as I've mentioned, there was a lot of indoor or at least household work to be done. Generally, the senior married woman in a household of whatever sort was responsible for directing and performing much of the indoor work. Housekeepers that were hired to run houses for a mistress will emerge as more common in the 19th century and forward. But in the 18th century and earlier, it was a married woman's place to plan, direct, and take on most of the essential and complex indoor tasks. To help her, she would usually have at least one other adult woman to help her, a sister, a cousin, an aunt, or an unrelated hired or enslaved woman. For the myriad other repetitive and menial tasks, churning butter, shelling beans, drying apples, checking supplies for rot, collecting ashes, scrubbing pots, turning meat on spits, beating rugs, sweeping or scrubbing floors, shucking and pounding corn, and so on, children's, one's own, or of course orphans and enslaved children, both boys and girls, could be found indoors performing these tasks. The story that we've been told in America, that the southern colonies had slaves and they worked on plantations, and then the northern colonies were virtuous hard workers that did without and were frugal, practical, industrious, and inventive Yankees, not so much. The records say differently. The sheer volume of household work meant that people were bought and sold into and out of all sorts of farms and homes all over the northern colonies as well as the southern ones to do labor as slaves in all manner of homes. New York, in fact, had one of the most vibrant markets for selling enslaved captives. The pirates in their base in Madagascar I spoke of back in episode 50 did much to add to this trade. There were skilled enslaved women in brewing, dairying, and cooking who would be sold as part of a house sale. The advertisements are to be found. They would also be willed or given as part of wedding gifts and dowries, for it was acknowledged that these were important skills to master, but also tricky to do. Because of the thick tapestry of differing religious convictions that covered the more thickly settled areas in and around Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, all sorts of people, who by their dress or complexion were clearly not of the upper class, regularly carried markers showing where they belonged, and their status as free, indentured, or enslaved. The people, mainly women who worked indoor jobs, were more likely to be known as they crossed paths with people often. The 19th century conceits of servants being more or less invisible to the big family were developing, but the realities of house construction and how the world operated meant such separations were neither possible nor practical. The fact that indoor servants were likely to be generally known, or at least recognized, might not keep them safe exactly, but it would mean generally that their status was less in question. Again, as a town or community got bigger, you were less likely to know everyone, and such medals, tokens, and markers would become more important. So there we are, indentured, orphan, enslaved, hired, and related. These are the sorts of people who worked household jobs. They were almost entirely women and children. Men did sometimes run kitchens, especially in larger, grander, more socially prominent homes, in imitation of the emerging French and Italian chefs of Europe. And there would be men who worked as a body servant or valet for men as well. Remember that clothes are hard to get into and out of alone the fancier you get. Oh yeah, and wig care. But the men who had such a servant usually brought him along to help with his other daily work, sharpening pens, making fair copies of letters and documents in his office, or keeping notes or running errands to communicate instructions or gather information on his farm. And the men who worked in these personal capacities generally weren't tied up in the menial household work. Which means, in the 18th century, who worked inside and did the household work, it was a wild mix of people, and would continue that way. Most of the media that has been available for us to consume has made it a much simpler picture. And by the end of the 19th century, the people with the most money will want to make things seem regular and interchangeable, down to providing indoor servants with identical and mandated uniforms, livery. But that is definitely not what was going on in the 18th century. People wore their own clothing, though sometimes the fabric might be provided by the people they worked for or be made over from old clothing. Sure, lots of people couldn't read or do math, but if you worked in a household job, you probably could do a decent job of making your own clothes, and you could definitely repair them. So overall, the reality is, having people work in your house on a daily basis and more or less living with you, it's a tricky business. There never was a simple and predictable set of people, and the relationships always have been complicated. And up until the 20th century, it would be reasonable to assume that the majority of women either had someone working in their home to help them with household tasks, or they worked in another woman's home. Being a woman who is capably and impressively running her own home on her own, that's entirely a 20th century American conceit. And oh boy, will I get into that. In the 18th century, you couldn't do it alone, not even close. Next week, I'll head outdoors and see what the labor situation around growing, capturing, hunting, harvesting, and processing food outdoors looks like. For starters, the situation is no less complex. There are definitely more men, the children are mostly older, and women usually only show up during harvest or during times of war and strife. Oh, and there's more temporary labor. Thanks for listening. Any questions or quibbles will reach me by email at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Also, make sure to start sending in questions for the end of the season show. A few words to review this podcast on your favorite podcast widget really do make a difference and help make me more visible to the food and history curious alike. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is in the show's Twitter and Insta and post.news bios at THOA Food and in the show description.